This panel today is going to be talking about, as you've just said, the decarbonisation and resilience opportunity. And I have two very esteemed colleagues on the panel, Jillian Broadbent, who's a non-executive director of Macquarie, but also was the founding chair of the Clean Energy Finance Corporation, among many other distinguished roles, and Ian Kay, who is the Chief Investment Officer of ARENA, the Australian Renewable Energy Agency. And together, the CFC and ARENA represent two of the most important institutions in Australia in terms of government financing of the clean energy revolution that is going on in this country. And also, I think many people forget both those institutions are also often very highly regarded internationally, and many people see those institutions as playing a key role. And much of that is down to the great efforts of both Jillian and Ian and the role that they play. So what I'm going to do to kick off this session is just to start off to introduce Jillian first, to talk a little bit about her perspective, and then to Ian, and then we'll get into some questions. So Jillian, over to you first.
Thank you, Martijn. My background was in as an economist and a mathematician, and I had a career in banking, and then I was invited to join the board of the Reserve Bank. So I then became a non-executive director of a number of companies: Woodside, Woolworths, Westfield. Not all of them start with W. Swiss Re Insurance. And in 2011, the then Treasurer Wayne Swan invited me to, not a terribly comfortable invitation, but to take on a review of the feasibility of setting up a $10 billion clean energy finance corporation to invest in renewable energy, energy efficiency and low emissions technologies. And through that, I guess as an economist, I was very conscious of the really important role that government plays in setting the foundations for economic growth in Australia and the well-being of all Australians. So I felt it was very important to take on this task, and through the interaction with we had so many submissions into this review, and the interviews that I undertook, I totally immersed myself in the sector. And I was so inspired by what was out there, the appetite for doing things, the capacity to do things. And so it was in that environment that I completed the review. The government enacted the Clean Energy Finance Corporation Act and invited me to be the inaugural chair. So I took that on, and as some may remember, there was a lot of resistance from the incoming government to abolish us, but we stayed our course, and I'm very proud of that legacy.
Ian?
Thanks, Martijn. So my background is also investment banking, and laterally in that career, developing and investing in renewable energy projects, and then I had a short stint at Origin Energy, and I think it was actually Martijn suggested to me that the job at ARENA was available, and had I thought about applying for it, and I hadn't, but did a bit of investigation, and spoke to the then chair and the CEO. And realised the pivotal role that ARENA, together with the CEFC, would have to play in supporting the transition of Australia towards net zero. And that's very much what ARENA does, is to support the global transition towards net zero. And we do that by accelerating commercial innovation that really across the stage of investment, from starting with R&D in the universities through to hopefully taking those technologies out of the universities, perhaps then to a deployment, to a demonstration project, then perhaps to a deployment project, and then the last stage is building up to large stage commercialization. And I guess, Jillian, that's where ARENA kind of steps out, and the CEFC takes over.
So I think one of the interesting questions is that at the moment, everything is moving very fast, and investment's moving very quickly into the energy sector. There's new technologies all the time arising, and with those new technologies comes new risk, but the role of organisations like CFC and ARENA remains critical, but it also sort of evolves. So from your perspective, I mean, Jillian, it's almost 10 years since CFC was set up. It played a formative role in the transition. Now that role's a little bit different. How do you both see the role of institutions like CFC and ARENA evolving as the sector evolves?
Yes, it's interesting looking back on, as you say, it's nearly 10 years ago, and when the CFC was established, the renewable energy target was being promoted as being abandoned, and it was being questioned. So the conventional banks were saying, we don't really want to invest in renewable energy because we don't know if we're going to get our money back. So the early investments for the CEFC were very much wind farms, solar projects, because that was the area that needed support. And it was also a very secure, strong foundation for the CEFC, who has been able to provide a dividend to the government from their activities. So it was, it's interesting, when we had an event for the termination of my term, 5 years as the chair of CEFC, there happened to be a renewable energy conference in Parliament House, and someone came up to me and said, "Thank you for holding our hand in the darkest hours." And it just reminded me of how critical the CEFC was to doing what was really basic, fairly conservative financing of renewable energy projects. But you're right, Martijn, they have moved on to what is probably a more risky area. So they've set up specific funds, an innovation fund, a hydrogen development fund. So while it's $10 billion and the funds rotate, they are moving where the capital is needed to act as a catalyst, which they were always determined to be, to accelerate the investment in the emissions reduction task. And that task was, in the early stages, just supporting the renewable energy industry, but they are very open and have always worked closely with ARENA, because while there's not an exact fit, ARENA is spreading very thinly in broad development prospects, and the CEFC is waiting to see what comes through and what needs to be picked up, and mobilising commercial capital to make that happen. But one of the things that really worked at the CEFC was this catalyst role, where sometimes I felt we were a matchmaker. Someone had come in the door and say, "We want this," and we say, "You should meet so-and-so." And we really did make things happen by acting as a catalyst in that capacity. So sometimes putting money into it, but sometimes just facilitating the introduction of potential equity investors and potential lenders, and then coming in where the gap was.
Yeah. And Ian, in the case of ARENA, obviously the mandate has expanded a bit, and a key focus on industrial decarbonisation as well. Talk us through how ARENA is changing its role, and where you see opportunities through ARENA going forward.
Yeah, so I think, and maybe just to kind of pick up on what Jillian said, we had large-scale solar, which is now happening by itself commercially, which is absolutely fabulous. Back in the early days, so I'm guessing 2015, 2016, large-scale PV needed something. It was in excess of a 50% grant to the capital cost to get those projects to happen. And then it kind of went down to 30%, and then we did the very successful round with the CEFC, where ARENA kind of put 10% of the capital stack in. I think the CEFC put in 50 or 60, and the rest was equity. And then, as we all know, large-scale PV now in Australia is commercial and happens by itself. And there's a number of technologies, and I'm not even sure if they're technologies as such, but for example, large-scale batteries, again, not commercial, but are on the cusp of becoming commercial. And we've got hydrogen electrolyzers that are very much not commercial at the moment, that you can see following the same pathway, I think over the next 3, 5, 8 years, where they need a very substantial grant today, but as we gain experience in building those projects, the costs will come down. And so, in terms of industry taking up those challenges, Martijn, at ARENA, same in the CEFC, we tend to be led by the market. So we are very heavily integrated with the market, and support what the market wants to chase. We do the introduction, so I think that's a very important part of what both organisations do to try and de-risk projects as much as possible before they go ahead. And so, as you say, Martijn, it's hydrogen is going to be key. It's going to be key, particularly around low emissions metals, playing into the ammonia industry for the production of ammonia. And we've got domestic players who we need to support to build domestic industries. as we get the confidence of those, then we'll start to export in larger quantities than we're building domestically.
Yeah. And so one of the things that we are seeing at the moment is a massive wall of capital. You've seen Brookfield, TPG, many others announce massive transition funds up to 6, 7, 8, 10 billion. Macquarie is obviously taking a leadership role in green investment. Obviously, one of the things that I often hear with this wall of capital is it's hard to find the investments. And when you do find investments, sometimes the technology is still fairly risky. Which then sort of raises issues about short-term risk, long-term investment. Macquarie's been thinking a lot about this. Jillian, where do you see that playing out?
Well, Macquarie's had a decarbonisation as a stream of their strategy for probably a couple of decades. But they are a very astute assessor of risk and where the funds have tolerance for risk and where they don't. So they may invest in early technologies a very small amount in an equity sense, yep. And then they may facilitate investments, institutional money into more established renewable energy projects. But it's interesting with Ian talking about electrolysers in the hydrogen industry, and everyone said, oh, hydrogen's going to be the answer. It sort of had a little bit of a flavour of a gas-led recovery to me, but I've become a bit cynical. But I think hydrogen is going to be a very big thing in 10 years' time. Yep. And one thing I really saw through the time involved with the CEFC is people would talk about coming down the cost curve, but when we look at even solar panels, I mean, the cost curve, you came down 80%. I mean, it wasn't just coming down the cost curve very gradually. Yep. It was really fast. And I think electrolysers will be the same thing. The whole hydrogen industry will go very fast because of that weight of capital that is a little bit risk averse. But once the industry knows there's a demand out there and there's a dynamic, that coming down the cost curve will really be accelerated. And I think we'll see hydrogen picking up with pilots, with some risk money from ARENA, some money from CEFC, some money from Fortescue, who's interested in green hydrogen, and even the international oil companies who know the writing is on the wall, that oil and gas are not going to be what they were 30 years ago for their growth path. So what Macquarie sees is all of their clients, because they're very active right across the spectrum of energy and electricity generation and infrastructure, they see this appetite for everyone wanting to participate in this dynamic, and they try to facilitate it.
Yep. And Ian, I mean, in the sense of hydrogen, you're obviously looking at it very closely. You've gone through a funding round at the moment with electrolysers. What is your observation on how hydrogen's playing out?
So there's certainly a lot of interest in it, and the key at the moment, Martijn, is really the cost of hydrogen. So to put it in context, to be able to produce hydrogen today for the $2 per kilo, which is kind of the target, you need an electricity price of $35 a megawatt hour. So the key to make all of that work is going to be to make sure that we've got over in the East Coast, the NEM working properly, and over in the West Coast that we've got the WEM working properly. Because we've got to be able to get that low-cost power, whether it's for electrolysers or whether it's for electrification of industry generally, and to make sure that that's provided reliably. So I think what that means, and we kind of talk about the LCOE of energy, which is kind of the average price, if you like, to produce a megawatt from be it wind, be it solar, or be it from or be it stored from those sources and coming from a battery. So that's kind of the cost, if you like. But the other thing that we need to think about is the value of electricity. So not every megawatt that's produced every hour of the day attracts the same value. So we've got to make sure that we're using the high value megawatts when we really need to be using them. So particularly around residential use in the evenings when we're all cooking our dinner and watching TV. But we make sure that we're using the lower value electrons to be able to be stored and perhaps used to produce hydrogen at that time, and to support industry. So I think we've done a really good job as a first cut in terms of the utility scale. So we've got large-scale wind, we've got large-scale solar, we're starting to see large-scale batteries, we've got Snowy 2.0, that we've got the big Genix pumped hydro project up in North Queensland. What we're not so good at is controlling the electricity that's starting to come off all our rooftops now back into the electricity network and using that in the most efficient way. So there's a lot of work that we need to do around controlling the distributed energy resources, or DER, at that level, and also encourage big users of electricity to be able to use it in a more flexible way. So to say I need a flat load demand of X 24 hours a day, I don't think it's going to cut it anymore to be able to do it at a sensible price. So we're seeing people starting to play around and develop technologies and ideas about how they do that.
Interesting when you mentioned demand management. I remember there was a statistic that California has about 8% of its generation managed through demand management. Yep. So that's really not saying I need it 24/7 and you sort out how you get it to me. It's really participating in that supply-demand dynamic, and Australia was less than 1%. We've been very lazy on that, and I think it's the coordination of all of the elements of the electricity users, the generation, the distributed energy coming together. And I think there's a recognition that that's needed. And yep. This initiative of the AEMO, of yep. setting up AEMO services with the New South Wales government to say, what can we do to make sure the distribution from the remote generation gets to where the demand is? And really, if you look at the hydrogen solution, a lot's got to do with where you put the demand, if you've got flexibility to have it, and how you get all those pieces together, because there's no doubt Australia has enormous capacity to generate renewable energy, but if it's not in the right place, it's pretty expensive and not very usable. Yeah. And you can talk about, well, you can export it, but all of that's a long way down the track in terms of energy from hydrogen. But I do think looking and cooperating across the states and across the generators and the users to get this system to work better. There's a lot of low-hanging fruit there that's ready to be picked. So
a lot of what you're both talking about at the moment is the fact that we have this national electricity market that was really built on large power stations and transmission lines. It's being interrupted a lot at the moment, particularly as you comment on, Ian, rooftop solar. So for the longer term, what are the key things we need to do to build a more resilient national electricity market and system, and where do you see the national electricity market or the actual energy market on the east coast of Australia being in, say, 5 years' time?
Well, I think it has to be more responsive to pricing, and as Ian said, you get the most expensive only being used in an emergency, so all of that needs to be coordinated, and the market will play an important part in that. But it seems to me the whole the structure that was set up when the NEM was established, which was probably 20 years, more than 20 years ago, but it's amazingly, it hasn't been able to move with what's been happening, and there's been a resistance from the Energy Council, the state energy ministers and the federal government not wanting to really make big decisions, that there hasn't been the infrastructure there to be able to respond to all of these dynamics. So I really think if and when we get a momentum on the federal government with emissions reduction, and you get an easing up and of the stalemate that's been there with the stalemate that's been there with and stagnation been there with the energy ministers and the federal government, then you start to get sensible policy being made, I think.
But do you think that when a state makes policy, it thinks about it on a state basis or on a NEM basis? Because often we see a state government wanting to be the centre of hydrogen, but not considering how do we get the best result for the whole of the NEM.
Well, I think that their constituents are the state voters, and because there hasn't been a national policy that they've wanted to align themselves with, they've had to do things on a state-by-state basis. So I do think the fact that the New South Wales government, we just heard from Matt Keane on this, and I think they've recognised we cannot wait forever for the federal government to do something. We're going to do what is in our capacity to make a contribution and get a dynamic going and look at the distribution within Australia, and I think they will bring it together probably at a state level, and then those learnings can be transported to another state while you wait around for the federal government to get on the boat.
Yep. And Ian, you guys on the issue of NEM resilience have looked a lot at investment in software platforms, in a whole range of different pricing structures. Talk us a little bit how you see the best way that we can sort of stabilise them to prepare it for a more, I guess, innovative energy system.
Yes. So I think there's two things. One, does the technology work? So you've got to prove that the technology works or the software solution works. And then the second thing is, how do you optimize the introduction of that technology to I guess, minimize the cost to the electricity users in the system, be that minimizing the amount of generation that you need to provide, or be that minimizing the amount of transmission that you need to provide. So we're still pretty much at the stage, Martijn, of really does the technology work, because you've got to have confidence the technology works before you think about changing the regulation, and before you start thinking about tariff structures and how do you optimize the behavior from the consumers. So that is starting, and ARENA works very closely with the AEMC and the AR as well as IEMO, and have developed a number of have put forward a number of propositions where if you did this rule change, it would lead to X, and those bodies are starting to take those up in terms of promoting rule changes, which is actually very encouraging.
And then interesting, when you look at what's happening overseas, and you look at, so for example, Macquarie took the lead in offshore wind. ARENA's looked at offshore wind, the government's looking at regulations. There are other technologies overseas. What opportunities do you see for sort of those things that have worked overseas to be brought to Australia?
Well, I think what's worked overseas is governments committed to an emissions reduction target more aggressively than our government's been committed to. So if you take offshore wind, where the equivalent of the CEFC, the Green Investment Bank, that was set up in the UK exactly the same time as the CEFC was set up here, and they had three streams they were looking at. One was energy efficiency, one was waste to energy, and one was offshore wind. And at the time, we thought, gosh, why would you have offshore wind? You know, that seems like an expensive way to go. Well, that was expensive by Australia's standard because we had so much cheaper alternatives. But you know, that was 10 years ago, and now offshore wind, they're leaders in offshore wind. And partly their determination, or the government determination, was because they were dependent on Russia gas coming from Russia, so they weren't energy self-sufficient like we've been. So they had a more compelling economic reason for being committed to it. But you know, they got on the boat early, and they're reaping the benefits from that, not only being in an industry that's in demand now with offshore wind, but the government settings really made that happen. And once the government settings are there, facilitators like Macquarie Bank can work in the system to say, okay, if you want to have that as your goal, we can mobilise money here. And all of the players, if you like, the financial institutions who want to put money in, or the startups, they know the path you're on, whereas we haven't had a path. We've been operating in the dark.
Yeah, and I think as well as we go through the transition, I think we have to be realistic about where we are. So we're kind of on average, 20%, a little bit more renewable energy, with at the moment kind of 50% penetration at peak periods on average. So we've actually got quite a long way to go. But as you say, Jillian, you can kind of see that we've got very strong transmission infrastructure down the east coast, and it's actually quite adjacent to windy areas offshore. So you can actually see that there are a number of precincts, the Bass Strait being probably the one that's talked about most, where you can have an offshore wind industry there, kind of plugging into the Latrobe Valley transmission network. So you're reusing those assets, but with new technologies.
It's interesting when you talk about wind farms, and this was a sort of revelation to me 10 years ago, when the Danish companies would be saying, oh, the wind capacity in Australia is 30% better than Denmark or Germany. And I'm going, oh, really? Just because, as you say, in the Bass Strait, the roaring 40s, and I mean, we've got, and the sun capacity was so much better than Germany. And you say, of course it is. We are so well endowed in renewable energy resources, but we are a big country, and we do have to get the energy generation onto the grid, and we still need investment in the infrastructure to optimise that. But we certainly have very good resources.
So we're sort of talking about where we are at the moment and where we can go. The panel this morning, really, with WEF and the report of the Business Council, is talking about going to 600% renewable energy and making Australia a powerhouse of exporting renewables. So what is the transition? What are the building blocks that are required to make that jump, in your opinion?
Well, I think that the building blocks are getting on the boat and also riding down the cost curve, and the government supporting that as a strategy other than just through words. Because interestingly, with my involvement with Woodside, just watching the coming down the cost curve on natural gas, LNG trains came down by 50% in cost, and this cost curve is the way it will happen, but it does require scale, it requires demand. And if we go back to even the early LNG industry, where we had fixed contracts from the Japanese energy companies, and the same thing will happen here. I think it will be Japan that's the base investor by providing the equivalent of a PPA in the domestic market, and that then it's getting all the components where the prize is big for the users of energy who want to be carbon free, the generators of energy who recognise they've got to meet that demand. And so we could well get there. It's probably 20 years away, but all of these things that you tend to project in decades, whereas having watched it, it happens more quickly than that. Yep. Once you get clear policy and you mobilise the fantastic creativity of the Australian industry, because Australia had the longest horizontal subsea pipes. I mean, we're fantastic at taking what's going on in the rest of the world and optimising it here.
Ian, from your perspective?
Yeah, I'd agree with that, and I think the way I would describe it is that we've got to be bold. So hydrogen is an opportunity for us to be able to export our fabulous energy resources that we have here. It is going to be some time before we are exporting in substantial quantity, would be my guess. But we've got to take bold steps now to set regulation, or if it's not setting regulation, to actually be prepared to invest really large sums of both government and corporate money almost now to start that process. It will be a loss leader to start, but we've got to take those bold steps to make sure that we're attracting the largely offshore technologies in the form of electrolyzers into this country, and actually demonstrating that we are a large and viable market for those technologies.
And I think the oil and gas companies are interested in putting their capital into this journey. So it is some risk money, but they've always had long-term horizons for return on capital, and they're very invested in the industry. So some of the skills are transferable, not necessarily the infrastructure, but the skills and capacity to solve big engineering problems with smart people and long-term returns. I think they're they've got a good track record in that area.
I think one will argue they don't really have a choice because of they'll become stranded assets, and as we see, investors are moving away from that rapidly.
Well, I think they recognise that.
Yep. And so that deployment of capital is definitely required. Well, we've got just about a minute left, so I might just ask if either of you had a sort of a concluding comment you'd like to share.
Only to repeat Ian's call for be bold, and just talking about this subject, I remember the enthusiasm in the industry and the capacity that we can get there if we just are bold and we have government all leaning in rather than pulling apart.
Yeah.
Yep, agree. So I think the majority of the technologies that we're going to need by 2030 are already here. They are immature, but they do by and large exist, and it's moving them forwards and commercialising them that's going to be the really important thing to do.
And scaling them.
Scaling.
Okay, well, we're at the end now, so I just wanted to thank everybody for tuning into this panel. It's been a privilege to have Ian and Jillian on this, and I will say, having worked with them both for many years, it's also very nice to be chairing the panel with them. So thank you for tuning in. Thanks, Jillian. Thanks, Ian.
Martijn.
And look forward to you enjoying more of the conference. Thank you.